Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. In one of my previous videos, I briefly mentioned that I wanted to eventually discuss in good detail the subject of cryptid dinosaurs. And the reason that I want to examine that is because I think it's a very interesting and a really weird topic, in all honesty. We have a lot of, especially the younger generations here, dinosaurs are a pretty prevalent thing in our culture. Just look at movies for, one example of that. And you'll find that it's pretty prevalent, in most of popular media, at least concerning fictional stories. And I think the reason for that is because we find it so fascinating that millions of years ago the Earth was so vastly different and that these fantastic creatures actually existed at some point. That's part of what makes these dinosaur cryptids so weird to think about, because these are creatures that are supposed to be extinct, and they're usually not very small animals. Coelacanths are one thing. They're fish that are of considerable size, but they're fish. They can stay hidden in water fairly easily, from our sight at least. Dinosaurs, in their hand, are a much different animal, and they would presumably have a hard time staying so hidden from us. Of course, that depends on numbers and population and all those other factors, which we'll actually discuss here today. Taking all that into consideration, the dinosaur cryptid phenomenon is fairly global, and so I decided to focus in on what I believe to be one of, if not the most interesting case of a dinosaurian cryptid, the Burrunjor. So we will start off with an introduction to what the Burrunjor is supposed to be. The earliest reference to the Burrunjor can actually be found in Aboriginal cave paintings. This is an Australian cryptid, and Aborigines, being the native people of Australia, were there for longer than the newer settlers that brought in this new age that we see all around the world now were. This is probably the most popular example right here of an Aboriginal cave painting of a Burrunjor, and there are a few other examples that are debatable. There was one in particular that I saw that I'll admit resembles more so a prehistoric bird that existed until a few thousand years ago than a dinosaur of any kind. But I digress, because this one certainly looks more like a dinosaur, I'll admit, than a bird. When I was speaking with Russell Ladmore not too long ago on my first edition of my podcast, we briefly talked about a video he had showed me of Aborigines showing explorers, or I suppose tourists maybe, these tracks in the sand, and they appeared to be dinosaurian in nature. And these are not the first tracks that have been found to suggest the Burrunjor's existence. In fact, aside from eyewitness testimony, this is probably the most common form of evidence that we find that could support the Burrunjor. The other most common piece of evidence is actually cattle killings. During the 1950s, there was a streak of cattle killings that were quite brutal in nature, and, according to the account, left most of the cattle half devoured, which I'm not quite sure what that suggests, other than the fact that something came in, had its fill, and then left. Now, what's interesting is these two events are actually linked, these tracks and these killings, because the 1950s cattle killings were some of the first examples of these weird tracks being found, and they actually brought on the first onslaught of modern, you could say, sightings. And this is where we step into the idea of, okay, well, if there is a Burrunjor, let's assume that for a second, what kind of dinosaur are we looking at here? There have been a few accounts, especially with these cattle killings, of people getting fed up that something's eating their cattle, and they go out and they try to find it. So they follow these tracks. Most of the time, actually I think all the time, have been described as they look like the tracks of a two-legged giant lizard, which is interesting because, how would you describe a dinosaur if you didn't quite know the scientific definition of one? So a lot of these hunters went out into the wild and tracked these prints for quite a long time, and in one case, and this is interesting actually because this says something environmentally about these creatures if they do exist, they came upon the tracks going into swampland and into denser brush, and upon coming into the swampland, the dogs that they had with them refused to go further, as did the horses that were with them. A few of these hunters decided to go forward a little bit anyway, and reported seeing massive shapes in the woods that were moving that they described as, they actually related them to looking like tyrannosaurs. They described them as being around 25 to 30 feet tall. That's the average height that seems to be reported with Burrunjors. And in just about all cases of these sightings, the people perhaps wisely, flee immediately. So there's never really a good look at them, if they do exist. The most descriptions that I've seen for the color of a Burrunjor is gray to mottled, which is, I suppose, a conglomeration of several different and yet similar colors. So they've been described as usually dull in color tyrannosaurs that are able to traverse through difficult terrain fairly easily. And most sightings describe something like that. There was quite a few that I read up on Rex Gilroy's website, actually, who is renowned for tracking the Burrunjor, so to speak. And he's actually responsible for casting the first casted prints some believe are from a Burrunjor.
Country up at Currumbin on the Gulf of Carpentaria. I found 2 years ago with Heather, and this creature had walked through a paddock during the night and walked across a little dry sandy creek about a couple of metres wide, and there were a couple of tracks there, and I only had enough plaster for one anyway, but I took photos and slides. It didn't come out too good, but I got this, and that convinces me Burrunjor exists. Burrunjor is a giant bipedal reptilian creature in Aboriginal folklore. He can't be a giant lizard standing on two legs like some monitors are known to do, when they've been seen running. He's got 3 toes and not 5. That makes him something like, well, people would naturally think of a Tyrannosaurus, and it's along that line, but who's to say that they're not around still? The Gulf.
Now, the thing about these tracks is they look like a Tyrannosaurus tracks. There's no other way to put it. There have been a lot of tracks of Tyrannosaurus that have been preserved fairly well throughout the millions of years that they've been there, obviously. And the one difference that I see is in size, and even then the difference isn't huge, but it's enough to say one is smaller than the other if the Burrunjor does exist. However, the finds are significant because they're often fresh tracks, not tracks that have been preserved, so to speak. Back on the subject of the environment, if we are to entertain the notion that there is possibly a tyrannosaur, or at least predatory dinosaur, surviving in Australia, there are a lot of factors that have to be considered to really think about that scientifically. One of them is the creature's environment, where it lives and how where it lives could support it. A lot of natives, aborigines, and people who just live in those areas believe that the Burrunjors actually survive in the more mountainous regions, and when food is scarce, they'll come down to the more flat areas, like the Outback or like farmlands that are distant from populated spots, and they'll actually take the cattle or they'll have their fill of them and leave. And that's all well and good, but you've got to consider, well, a creature that size can only feed on so many cattle and so many animals a day, right? To really say that, you've got to know how much would a tyrannosaur-like animal need to eat daily. And the answer might actually surprise you. Tyrannosaurs did not need to eat a whole lot daily. If we were to take humans as a population that tyrannosaurs could feed on if they still existed, a tyrannosaur, a single tyrannosaur, fully grown, would only need to eat about half of a male human adult, an average human male adult, per day. That's it. A few 100 pounds could tide it over for a few days. Looking at the possible food population of Australia, we actually do seem to come upon a population that would suffice for a very small breeding population of tyrannosaurs, if taken in moderation. One thing I found very interesting is Australia actually has the highest wild camel population in the world. Now, they came over in the 1800s unnaturally. They were brought there. They became so widely used in Australia that there were so many of them that when they were basically done having to use them, they released all of them. There was no other way they could really get rid of them. And since then, they've multiplied tremendously. The population is expected to be somewhere between 600,000 to 1 million individuals today. And that's a lot of camels. Camels themselves weigh over 1,000 pounds. Granted, not all of that is meat. Some of that's bone, some of that's skin, etc., etc. But if we're talking about a population of, let's say, 200 Burrunjor tyrannosaur individuals that need to feed 100 pounds over a couple of days, about 1 million camels that are still climbing in population would just about do the trick, I would think, at least for a while. And there's actually a little bit of evidence to support that, and we'll get to that in a bit. Now, environmentally speaking, the food seems like it could sustain it. Of course, camels are not the only food source. There's also the cattle that we spoke of. There's smaller animals like dingoes. Even lizards, depending on how common they are in the area, could be a food source. Birds. And that's all well and good, but we also need to talk about the terrain that a tyrannosaur could survive in. Now, the thing about Australia is that the Outback is mostly deserts and mountains, which sounds like a pretty good environment actually for a tyrannosaur. There was actually an environmental factor that made me think about this briefly. I was reading about these sightings, and I remember hearing quite a few, or at least a considerable amount, that talked about the tracks disappearing into the swamplands. And I considered, well, if this is a dinosaur, what kind of dinosaur is it, obviously? And I was actually stuck between the Tyrannosaur and the Spinosaurus, because Spinosaurs were actually the most aquatic of all dinosaurs, at least in their type. They inhabited mostly swamplands, and were able to come up on land if they needed to. But the thing about Spinosaurus is that we now know they were actually four-legged, and these tracks do seem to resemble not only Tyrannosaur tracks, but they're two-legged. So clearly, if there is something going on here, it's not a quadrupedal animal, it's a bipedal animal, which supports the idea that maybe Burrunjor is a Tyrannosaurus rex or is a descendant of the Tyrannosaurus rex. Again, the size in the Burrunjor tracks is actually a little bit smaller than those of Tyrannosaurus tracks. What exactly that means, I'm not sure. The evidence we have thus far for Burrunjor is eyewitness sightings, mutilations of cattle, and tracks, some of which are extremely interesting, like the ones found by Rex Gilroy. However, there are a few problems that we run into when talking about the Burrunjor. For one thing, it is now known that a lot of dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus, had feathers. While feathers would be a great benefit to Tyrannosaurs in a climate like Australia's, none of the sightings talk about feathers. Now, none of them have been extremely up close, so I suppose that maybe if they are seeing Tyrannosaurs or something like a Tyrannosaur, then feathers simply aren't observed clearly and thought to just be scales, as there are scaly patches on Tyrannosaurs, as we now know. Another issue is population. Let's say we have about 200 individuals in a breeding population, and we have a lot of food to feed them, including all those camels. Still, after about a decade, they've taken out a considerable portion of the camel population, but maybe those camels are breeding fast enough. Let's give it that. It can be difficult to maintain a diet like that, especially only with 200 individuals. Over time, that number can become very small, or miraculously can become very large, but most of the time that number will become smaller and smaller. Coincidentally, there have not been Burrunjor sightings in over 2 decades now. What exactly that means? I'm not sure if anyone's really sure, but one thing that it could mean is that if these animals did exist, they may in fact be extinct now, and it might not be all that difficult to know why. However, even with these challenges facing the idea of the Burrunjor, there are still ways for a species like that to overcome those issues. There is one glaring problem, though, and this is not to say that the Burrunjor is a real creature or that it's a fake creature. This video is not really about that. This video is discussing the subject of it and presenting information for you to form your own opinion on it. That being said, the most damning evidence against the Burrunjor's existence is Australia's own prehistory. Humans have only been documented on Australia for about 7,000 years, so Australia's history is actually quite young, and its prehistory is very, very old and long. And a lot of that prehistory involves giant mammals dying off in Australia. And at first, if we're talking about the Burrunjor, we could even take that as proof that, hey, maybe the Burrunjors were feeding off of these animals and that's why they died off. The thing about that, though, is that isn't what killed them. We do know what killed them, and it was the change in climate. These animals adapted to a very cold and dry climate in Australia, not something good for dinosaurs of any kind. When the new warm and dry climate finally kicked in, these mammals died off because they simply weren't adapted for that. And while a warm, dry climate would be okay for a dinosaur, the previous millions of years of cold, dry climate would not be, especially for dinosaurs that were evolving at the time. So, while we have instances of the Burrunjor going back thousands of years, all the way up to the very edge of Australia's history, and into relatively the modern day, all of its prehistory shows a pretty big issue for it. Not only did we have a climate that was not suitable for such a creature, we actually do not have any fossil record of a large carnivorous dinosaur on Australia. Now, that does not mean that there weren't any. Fossil records can be tough, especially when talking about apes, for example. Of course, now, apes and dinosaurs aren't the same thing, but it's proof that a creature that still exists today, even, can have a very small fossil record, sometimes none at all. At the very least, it shows that dinosaurs were able to inhabit Australia at some point, millions of years ago. However, again, the Ice Age really throws a wrench into that mix. Overall, the Burrunjor does have some sufficient ideas going for it, especially when we consider, well, how does it survive and how does it eat and where does it live? On the other hand, though, we have at least one example of prehistory that argues very efficiently against the idea of the Burrunjor. A sufficient food source in the wild, not just domestically, a good climate currently, tracks, ancient depictions, and somewhat modern sightings seem to lend credibility to the idea that at least people believe there is something very odd going on. And the fact that it's Tyrannosaurus-like in nature, especially with these cave depictions, is very weird, Ice Age or no Ice Age. Let me know what you all think about the Burrunjor in the comments. Do you think it is real? Do you think it could be real? I'm not sure what to make of it myself, but I think it's very interesting to think about these things because, for one thing, why the hell not? For another thing, and more importantly, it gives us a very good look into our own prehistory and makes us reconsider some things because who knows? This could be entirely fake misidentification of some other creature, like the bird I mentioned earlier. There could be no Burrunjor at all. Or this could be something that rewrites history. That being said, until next time.